The Real News. I'm Aaron Matek. At their meeting in Brussels last week, NATO members agreed to join the US-led alliance against the Islamic State.
We will agree on an action plan on NATO's role in stepping up our efforts in the fight against terrorism, and we will agree on national plans, making sure that we keep up the momentum on burden sharing, investing in our defense.
The announcement follows last week's suicide bombing at a concert in Manchester, England. But as NATO pledges to fight terrorism, now a picture emerges that ties its actions to that Manchester attack. The bomber, Salam Abedi, has a past deeply intertwined with NATO's 2011 bombing of Libya. Joining me is Max Blumenthal, senior editor for Alternet's Gray Zone Project. His latest piece is called "The Manchester Bombing is Blowback from the West's Disastrous Interventions and Covert Proxy Wars." So Max, your piece focuses on an angle of this bombing that's gotten a little bit of attention. You go pretty in depth. How is the Manchester bombing blowback from NATO's actions?
Well, most clearly, Salam Abedi and his younger brother Hashim were members of ISIS and its local affiliate in Libya. And there was no ISIS in Libya before Gaddafi's removal. In fact, according to a secret US cable in 2008, even the US embassy in Libya found him to be a partner against groups like this, and someone who was directly confronting, in the words of this cable, Saudi-backed Wahhabi ideology. That cable was written by J. Christopher Stevens, who was later killed in the Benghazi attack by another jihadist group that sprouted up after Gaddafi's killing and the destruction of his government. That group is Ansar al-Sharia. So these groups have filled the void left by NATO's disastrous intervention. But beyond that, we have the deep ties that go back well before Gaddafi's assassination between British intelligence, also U.S. The U.S. intelligence, French intelligence, but particularly British intelligence, with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Libyan Islamic Fighting Group was a collection of Afghan war veterans. They had fought in the anti-Soviet jihad that was backed by the CIA. This was sort of the baby, the brainchild of the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wanted to draw the Soviets into the Afghan trap by uparming the Mujahideen. And it led to what the CIA and other intelligence agencies have called a disposal problem, where basically hardcore Islamists and jihadists go to the Afghan battlefield, fight alongside CIA-trained Afghan Mujahideen, take their weapons, get the training, and then they go back to the countries they're from and they go abroad to continue to wage jihad. So this was the beginning of international jihadism. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group formed, and one of the ways that the British MI5, MI6 handled its disposal problem was to work hand in glove with the Libyan exile community around Manchester, for example, and the men who had participated in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group or sought to participate in it. The MI5 used the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in 1996 to attempt to assassinate Gaddafi. Actually, Libyan state TV in 1998 showed a failed grenade attack on Gaddafi. That was probably the result of this. A 2000 cable that was an MI5 cable was leaked online, reported by The Guardian, that showed that British intelligence had full knowledge of this assassination plot by the LIFG. Now, 8 years later, the UK classifies the LIFG as a terrorist group because it was deeply intertwined with the international network of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. A year later, the US does the same. Amazing. They finally recognized after 9/11 that this group that they've been working with is actually a threat to national security. They were working with it, of course, in the interest of empire, putting their own citizens' security at risk. 6 years later, the Arab Spring begins. An insurgency begins against Gaddafi. Gaddafi substantially rolls back the insurgency everywhere except Benghazi, and NATO intervenes. They intervene not only by air, but by working with Qatar and the Qatari royal family to arm the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. And from Manchester, the MI5 operates a rat line. This is very well documented. Middle East Eye ran an article about it. ironically a Qatari-backed outlet, and found that even people in Manchester who had been put under house arrest for alleged ties to extremists were given free movement to return to Libya. According to the New York Times, in a piece that didn't even mention the LIFG, but people from Manchester were quoted saying even drug dealers were allowed to go and fight in Manchester. So basically the MI5 was using this group. At one point they'll classify it as a terrorist group, then they'll turn on the tap when they decide they want to take out Gaddafi in 2011.
Yeah, Max, let me actually read to you from that Middle East Eye article. This is what they say. One British citizen with a Libyan background who was placed on a control order, effectively house arrest, said he was shocked that he was able to travel to Libya in 2011 shortly after his control order was lifted. I was allowed to go, no questions asked.
Right. And so one of the people who was allowed to go to Libya was Ramadan Abedi, who's still there. He is the father of Salman Abedi. Now, the London Telegraph reported that a neighbor of the Abedi family was one of the main bomb makers within the LIFG, who later founded kind of an offshoot that is directly affiliated now with Al-Qaeda. The bomb that Salman Abedi detonated in the Ariana Grande concert wasn't some cheap bomb that you find on the Anarchist Cookbook. It was enough, the explosive impact of this bomb was enough to kill 22 people. And the MI5 is in a state of chaos as they seek to break the network that was behind Salman Abedi. This network includes people in Libya. His younger brother's been arrested, but it also includes the ISIS affiliate in Libya. It also includes rebel groups in Syria. Apparently, Abedi had gone to Syria weeks before his attack, and that is where he supposedly was radicalized. Now, I don't know if that's the case, because he had been making noises about committing a suicide bombing in Manchester for years, and local residents, his Muslim neighbors, had reported him. They were deeply disturbed by this. What happened in Syria and what happened in Libya is that that's where he went to gain the training he needed to put this bomb together. And these areas where the West is fueling proxy wars, Qatar continues to back these Islamist militias in Libya. They're backing Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and the West is continuing to pump arms into Syria. That's where figures like Abedi go to get trained, and they come back. And so this is another aspect of blowback. Finally, I raised the question in my article, what did the MI5 know, and when did they know it? As I mentioned a minute ago, Abedi's neighbors had reported him to a counter-terror hotline, and the MI5 and the local authorities did nothing, even as Manchester was planning publicly for a catastrophic attack just like the kind he caused. Was it possible that Abedi was being groomed as an informant, just as the MI5 had attempted to groom Mohammed Emwazi, who later turned up in eastern Syria, beheading James Foley as the decapitator known as Jihadi John? That is a question for Theresa May, who is running for re-election, who was the Home Secretary in 2011 when the MI5 reestablished its rat line with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. And she would have been Home Secretary when Abedi was reported for threatening suicide bombings in Manchester. And these questions are not being raised loudly enough by the British press. Corbyn has hinted at this kind of relationship, but it needs to be made clear. The MI5 is initiating a self-investigation, which will be probably an opaque cover-up, an exercise in futility. What's needed is a public inquiry.
So, Max, since you bring up Corbyn, let me play for you a clip that a clip of his comments that caused a stir last week, when he talked about the connection between foreign intervention and foreign entanglement in the Middle East and terror attacks at home. Here he is.
Many experts, including professionals in our intelligence and security services, have pointed out the connections between wars that we've been involved in or supported and fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. Protecting this country requires us to be both strong against terrorism and strong against the causes of terrorism. The blame is with the terrorists, but if we are to protect our people, we must be honest about what threatens our security.
So, Max, it's pretty striking and I think perhaps unprecedented to hear the leader of a major political party and the candidate for the British leadership speak in such terms. And accordingly, his comments have not been well received by the British establishment.
Well, nothing he says, every time he coughs, the British establishment gets upset. I've never seen a figure of national stature in the UK get pilloried so hard. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has been the subject of so many fake scandals that it's in many cases the smears he's become kind of immune to these smears, and the British public is so turned off by the establishment that's now put their national security at risk that they're willing to give him a chance. He's surging in the polls. Jeremy Corbyn, who the Labour establishment and the Blairites had said could never win, is surging in the polls. He's pulled even with Theresa May among British women, and he could potentially, through the Progressive Alliance with Sinn Féin and the Scottish National Party and other parties, Corbyn's wing of Labour could hold a majority in Parliament if he continues to surge. And that is partly the result of this remarkable message that he delivered, linking the West's so-called war on terror to the insecurity of its own citizens. And we have yet to hear this from any US politician. There is no one like him in the Democratic Party, not Bernie Sanders and not even Jill Stein. We didn't hear anything like that from her. But what needs to be made clear also is that the war on terror has driven the rise of the far right. Regime change wars have driven the far right in Europe. Proxy wars like the one the West and its Gulf allies in Syria are driving the far right in Europe and the United States by creating refugee crises. Gaddafi in 2011 warned explicitly that not only would Libya be transformed, in his words, into an Al-Qaeda emirate, but a refugee crisis would fall on Europe's shores, that he was holding the migrant wave back from sub-Saharan Africa, where the West has simply pilloried these populations and they're forced to head north. What happened? All of his darkest prophecies were fulfilled. And today, Libya is a failed state after Gaddafi's fortunes and the state coffers were plundered by Western countries, especially France. We now see open-air slave markets in Libyan cities where African migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are bought and sold, according to the United Nations, according to testimony that UNICEF has gathered. Women from sub-Saharan Africa are beaten, raped, and starved, in their words, in living hellholes in Libya. This is the legacy of the NATO intervention, which pretty much everyone within the liberal establishment in Washington and London supported wholeheartedly. One of the few people who did not support that was Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn has stood up against every catastrophic intervention, and it's why he's gone from the backbenches of Parliament to a contender for 10 Downing Street. And we need to wonder when a figure like that will arise in the US.
Max, finally, I'm wondering if you can comment on what I think is a pretty striking contrast. On the one hand, you're laying out the factors behind radicalization and behind all these terrible developments that are linked directly to Western policies overseas. But yet, whenever a terrorist attack like this happens, the focus is always on the Muslim community inside those countries where it happened, or on refugees coming from abroad. Extensive commentary about how people are radicalized, and it's focused on the mosques. But you're saying it's actually rooted in Western policies. Can you talk about that contrast between the focus on Muslim communities versus Western policies overseas?
Well, it's a little bit of everything. I mean, we can't deny the role of Wahhabi ideology that's projected out of Saudi Arabia, and that they are exporting it across the world. This can't be denied. It can't be denied that Salman Abedi, like, for example, the Kouachi brothers in France, who were orphans of the French state, bear the legacy of colonialism. We can't deny that he was deeply alienated, even as a third-generation Libyan, and was drawn into a kind of nihilistic death cult known as ISIS, as a way of playing out psychological issues that he probably would not have experienced had his own country been systematically destroyed. Now, this is the case for many refugees, and almost none of them play out their psychological anxiety in a violent way. But we have to look at empire as well, and that's been my focus, and it's something that mainstream media, almost our entire political class, is terrified to discuss. Even the idea that we have imperial tendencies in this country or the West is almost verboten, and that makes it impossible to put this attack in context, and it drives the far right because it leads right-wing demagogues to place the blame, to divert the blame for where it should lie, and put it on to the Muslim community as a whole in Manchester, which had actually rejected Salman Abedi and his nihilism. So British people didn't understand why there was a refugee crisis from Syria. You look at the covers of the British tabloids, and it's fear and loathing of migrants and refugees every day, day after day, and no discussion of where they're coming from. They're coming from Libya, they're coming from Syria, they're coming from countries that the UK government and the MI5 and MI6 have explicitly participated in destroying. Brexit succeeded because of the fear and loathing of refugees. 80% of those who voted for Brexit voted on the immigration issue, not on the economy. It was UKIP, the far-right party of Nigel Farage, not the Conservative Party, that drove the Brexit campaign. And if you're unable to put into context the refugee crisis, you're unable to place the blame where it should lie, and the blame should be on interventionists. The interventionists caused this crisis, and that's why in the US, there's the anti-war movement is a shadow of its former self in Iraq. People are simply unable to even look at the consequences of intervention. So the reason that I wrote this article is just to provide the missing context. And I think it's the kind of context that could do deep damage to Theresa May and swing the British election if the British press were willing to talk about it more honestly.
Well, Max Blumenthal, we thank you for joining us and for providing that context. Max Blumenthal is a senior editor at Alternet's Gray Zone Project. His latest piece, The Manchester Bombing is Blowback from the West's Disastrous Interventions and Covert Proxy Wars. Max, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.